Relation Fund, based in headquarters in New York. Kiran Bhatia, my colleague, was supposed to moderate this session but had to unexpectedly head back to Bangkok. So I'd like to welcome you all again to this session. This session is entitled Understanding Men's Violence and Vulnerabilities. The session will explore research coming from various parts of the world that helps to explain the context of men's social conditions. Aspects that will specifically be explored during this session include men's relationships with hegemonic models of masculinity, men's use of violence, men's experiences of trauma, including sexual violence, and men's own vulnerabilities, including educational underachievement, poor mental health, and antisocial behavior. We will have 4 consecutive presentations followed by 30 minutes of discussion period and question and answer. So I ask for your patience as we go through the 4 presentations. Our first presentation is the UN multi-country study on men and violence in Asia and Pacific. It's entitled Implications for Violence Prevention Programming. The study, undertaken by Partners for Prevention, which is an interagency initiative including UN entities such as UNDP, UNFPA, UN Women, and UNZ. The study surveyed men in multiple countries across the Asian Pacific region. The study has provided valuable insights into factors associated with some men's use of violence and their varied experiences with violence. And to present that study, we have Mr. James Lang here with us. James is the Regional Advisor for UNDP in the Asian Pacific region. James, are you sure? Okay.
Let's just get on with it.
Okay, without further ado, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leila, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I know that you have lots of options, so thanks for choosing ours. It's the last day. It's been very exciting. So, again, thank you. I'm here, as was introduced, to present this multi-country study, and there are some summaries, and for the brave at heart, there's the full study of the regional analysis of this. I'm speaking about a quantitative survey that was done in Asia Pacific. The 3 main points that I want to talk about actually follow from very much the last plenary session, particularly what Lori Heisey presented. So when I present this data, I think what emerges that is relevant for this panel is that, first of all, the context and the intersections of different kinds of violence are critical. So I'll talk about how the patterns of different types of violence vary, as do the risk factors, the factors that drive violence particularly at the family relationship level. Then I'll, as the title implies, implications for programming, I'll talk about why data is important and how we're using it and to design prevention interventions. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how, interestingly, this quantitative study actually supports long-standing theories of gender and power, and in particular those of Raywin Connell and hegemonic masculinities, which was derived from empirical data of many, many years of qualitative work. And so just to get into it, oops, no. Sorry, that was not where I needed to go. Okay, so just very quickly, we did a survey that was complementing the WHO multi-country study on women's experiences on women, health, and violence. But we kind of flipped the questions and we asked them of men. So we have a data set of 10,000, about over 10,000 men and over 2,000 women from Asia Pacific. It was done in 9 sites across these 6 countries. it was a survey that was done with the same methodology as the WHO multi-country study, so it was randomized. This is not nationally representative data, but it's representative of the sites, and some of those sites, it's representative of a whole city. If it was done in Jakarta, it's representative of a province, and so forth. We had very sensitive questions that we asked men about their own experiences of violence, their experiences of having, using sex workers or having sex with children, having been raped or sexually abused, and so forth. So those were done. We actually used a handheld device. It was an iTouch, so the iPhone without the phone, and they were able to self-administer, so there was no bias of an interview when they were asked about those experiences of life. So we feel very confident about this data. This is the lifetime prevalence of men's reporting of using violence, different kinds of violence, and so my initial point was, that context and intersections are important. What you see here is the different colors in the bar represent different kinds of violence, and so across different sites, you see, for example, that physical violence is, which is what we think. This is intimate partner violence, by the way. We usually think of that physical violence as the predominant form, but in fact, in some sites, such as Cambodia or in Bougainville, sexual or physical and sexual were actually greater. Indonesia as well, sexual violence. This was in Jakarta. Sexual violence was more often reported by men. Men reported using sexual violence more often. So we see, this. It's not a static, and nor is it, the same consistent picture of patterns of different kinds of violence. And these different kinds of violence actually have different causes. I mean, as Lori talked about, this interplay of factors at different levels of the social ecology. They are different factors that drive different kinds of violence. They overlap very much. I mean, when we talk about macro level drivers and what she was referring to as the patriarchal triggers, those are very similar. But when we talk about why a man would slap his wife and why a man would rape somebody from the next village, there are different things we have to look at, and there's thus implications for how we would design interventions to respond to those different things. So in terms of why or how, why we did such a big study and how we're applying it, this is prevalence and risk factor data, and it's also talking about protective factors as well. So this is kind of a foundation of helping us understand this epidemic, this, the pandemic of violence against women, and we're using this in conjunction with the growing body of evidence from evaluations. So what kind of things are promising or effective what kind of interventions are promising or effective to address violence against women or gender-based violence, and how are these adaptable? Are these scalable? What were the critical elements of SASA that was presented? What was it about? What are the things about that really made it work? You saw how successful it was. So how can we boil down those critical elements and see if they are adaptable in what I'm describing as a very varied context around the world, even within countries, even within cities. So violence, has different kinds of violence spike in different ways over time and across location. I just wanted to dig a little bit more, and I'm in no way singling out Cambodia, but I wanted to talk about some of the data that's emerged. So, as I had mentioned, Cambodia is one of the places where, at the national level, in fact, the data in Cambodia is nationally representative. more men reported perpetrating sexual violence than physical violence. And then we broke down sexual violence into looking at marital rape or intimate partner sexual violence, non-partner rape, gang rape, and rape at any time within the lifetime. So this big picture prevalence number statistic, then you break that down into different forms of violence. And this, again, these numbers are. I think we really have to be careful when we talk about these kind of numbers. 20. It's not that 20% of men in Cambodia have raped or are raped. When we talk about this, we have to talk about the definitions of rape that we use, which is all about consent, and talk about how this data was collected, and men's perceptions of the questions. We never use the word rape in the survey. Then there's we ask questions about of the men who had self-reported perpetrating rape or sexual violence at any point in their lifetime. We ask them why they did it, and this again is data from Cambodia, but it's actually representative of the regional data set and the analysis that we did of the 10,000 men. The most commonly or the most frequently cited motivation for rape among the men that reported rape was sexual entitlement. And this is a phrase that we're using to describe words or questions like, because I wanted to show her that I could, because I wanted to have sex. So it's all about consent and all about men's sense of entitlement to women's bodies and women's choices. So that was the most frequently cited reason for rape among men. Secondly, punishment board, but interestingly, alcohol was the least common answer for all different kinds of sexual violence, and it was the least common cited answer in across the regional data and most of all of the sites. It was a little bit higher in some sites. We also looked at the data in terms of what was the age when a man first committed rape, and strikingly, over 50% of this is again Cambodia, but it's also representative of the data that is combined at the regional level. Over 50% were teenagers. They were 19 or younger, and you see even there's percentage of boys who were under 15 they were under 15 when they raped it the first time. So clearly there's implications about when we're addressing sexual violence, what kind of populations, what age groups we're working with. Then, we looked at men's own experiences of violence, and particularly during childhood, and within the regional data set, I mean this is not representing what I'm trying to say, but the most frequently the type of violence that most frequently occurred and seemed to have the strongest association with later perpetration in life was men's emotional abuse, which includes neglect. So these were experiences as children of not having consistent child care, being moved around a lot, not being fed regularly. So it's very much about caring. But in all cases, in all sites, we saw a very clear correlation between men's experiences of different kind of violence in their childhood, and including witnessing of their parents or their father beating their mother. And this finding, I think, is validated by many other studies on violence against children. So what do we do with all this? I mean, within the UN family and within our partners in development and governments, we're trying to advocate for much more research and evidence-driven prevention programming. So we take some of these findings, the low age of rape perpetration, the motivations around sexual entitlement, the perpetration associated with child abuse, the prevalence of gang rape, and we can design a fairly precise intervention using these to address sexual violence among teenage boys in Cambodia. There's larger issues at stake that what's happening in their lives, the kind of, what Lori referred to today is the lifetime burden of violence. So, we are experiencing and we are using violence across our life course, and we can't disconnect that. We can't just talk about one incident. But this is the kind of thing that we're using this data for. The second phase of Partners for Prevention is all about piloting evidence-based, research-driven interventions and then evaluating those. So we're going to do interventions in all the sites of this study. Oops, gosh, sorry, I'm going to have to keep on. Okay, so my last point was, we did this big quantitative data set, and quantitative data is well, I don't know if anyone was in the provocative, can't remember what he called it, but Yerker from IDS, Yerker Erstrom, was talking about how there's almost this a gendered value for different kinds of data, and that quantitative data is about measuring up, it's very male, and qualitative is very soft. In fact, we did a lot of qualitative data, we did a lot of political analysis that I'm not talking about as part of this study, but it is true that we do value quantitative data. And I think what is interesting is that this quantitative data set, which is, is a quite significant research undertaking, is actually reinforcing and validating, as I'm saying, or just, it's actually saying many of the same things that long-standing gender theories of gender, masculinity, and power, which I think is quite influential for all of the researchers in this study. So very quickly, this is the regional, these are the drivers of intimate partner violence from the 10,000 men. The size of the circle is the importance of that factor to predicting use of violence later. So what I was talking about, on one side you have, the kind of the dark colors. These to me are, when the story behind this, when you put them together, is telling a story about men trying to live up to an idealized version of masculinity. So men that are trying to perform heterosexually and have lots of sex, or try to have, including transactional sex, sex with sex workers, and more lifetime partners. Men that are using controlling behavior within their relationship, men that scored very low on the gendered equality attitude scale, the gender equitable attitude scale, the GEM scale. So men that hold very strict gender norms, men that control women and their bodies, men that fight and don't have skills for solving problems other than the spectrum that starts from quarreling to physical and sexual violence. And then the blue circles show men that are involved in gangs and using guns. So this is not, the hegemonic male. This is about men trying to live up to that version of hegemonic male. It's not the most powerful men that use violence against women always. It's men that are living up to that ideal, which is what Raywin Connell was talking about. On the flip side, you have the other side of the coin. What are the how have we experienced? How are we vulnerable as men when we're struggling with these hegemonic ideals? When we're struggling with masculinities that is not our own. It's not how necessarily we want to interact with the world. There's the vulnerabilities. So the childhood neglect, the witnessing of violence, the being socially marginalized, which we captured through things like food insecurity, low education attainment rates, and then there's the psychosocial consequences of that. So there's two sides of a coin represented quantitatively in the this multivariate analysis, which to me just reinforces what we've been saying all along in gender theory about masculinities. So I have to stop now, but just to say, there's an article about this that I've co-authored in The Lancet that's coming out next week with Michael Flood and Rachel Jukes, and please, all of this data, the summaries are there, and you can get all of the reports on our website, Partners for Prevention, with the number 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And the website has the questionnaires, there's a rich set of data there, and different relevant documents that you can find on the website. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation that shows us many varied experiences in use of violence, and highlighting, as you say, the different interplay of factors that drive different kinds of violence. And it's because it's validated, as you say, a lot of the gender theories around masculinity and violence, so it's very interesting. So moving on to our second presentation, which is entitled Beyond the Male Role Models, Gender Identities and Work with Young Men. It's a study that explores key policy and practice issues currently being addressed by the Open University Project, which is researching gender identities and practices in welfare work with young men aged 16 to 25 in the United Kingdom. The presentation will be delivered by Mr. Sandy Ruxton. Sandy is an independent researcher who graduated from Oxford, York, and London University. He is an honorary research fellow in Liverpool University and is the national ambassador for White Ribbon UK. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Right. So, how do I get out of you? Okay.
I just did this before, and then I screwed it.
Okay. Oh. That one. No, not that one, no. Sandy Ruxton there. No. No, not that one. Sorry. This one. That's right. And can we have it full screen now? Yeah? Okay. And to move on, I do something, yeah? Yeah? Okay, so don't do it. Okay. Right, sorry about that little glitch. Well, here comes some of the soft data following the statistical analysis that James has been providing. As was said, this is a research project which is being led by a team at the Open University in the UK. The Open University, for those of you who don't know it, is an institution that's been around since the late 1960s. It was set up by a Labour government to extend education to a wider set of the population who hadn't traditionally had that chance, and it was rather before its time in promoting distance learning as well, and it's still very involved in that field. The project's exploring gender identities and practices in work with young men. It's a partnership, as you can see, between the Open University and Action for Children. Action for Children is, I think, the second largest children's charity in the UK, running a whole range of services with disadvantaged children and youth. In this paper, what I'll do is I'll explain the background to our research, I'll outline the current project, and I'll talk a little bit about emerging themes from the data. I mean, I have to say that at the moment, we started in 2013, we're ending in April 2015, so we're right at the point where we have lots and lots of data, but we haven't done all the analysis. So I can give you a sense of our emerging themes, but I can't give you sort of definitive conclusions, but hopefully I'll give you enough that you'll get a sense of what we're exploring. I think it's also fair to say that our entry point to this research was this notion of male role models, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. But now, having done the interviews, and exploring the analysis, I think it's true that we've moved beyond a pure focus on role models, and there are a number of themes which are perhaps exist at a deeper level than just this overall umbrella term. Okay. Now, the problem of boys, I'm not going to say a vast amount about this slide just for time reasons, but I mean clearly boys and young men have been a key focus of public anxiety in the UK and in many other countries in recent years, in fact for many years. So I just highlighted some of the areas: offending, antisocial behaviour, educational underachievement, which I put in inverted commas, relative to girls, mental health problems, suicide, etc., impact of changing labour market, deindustrialisation. So all of these factors involved in the problem of boys. But I think it's fair to say that these concerns tend to centre on particular boys and young men. We always have to ask in this research, which boys, which young men are you talking about? Certainly in the UK, many of the boys and young men that we're talking about are those that we've always been concerned about, particularly working class boys and young men, and also I think perhaps more recently boys and young men from black and minority ethnic groups, but even there that's quite complicated because it's not all BME groups that are doing badly, some are actually doing quite well. Okay. We started off, as I say, with this notion of male role model discourse, composed as we see it, these key elements. So boys' problems largely caused by absent fathers, lone mothers, I could have put lesbian mothers down there as well, and lack of men in caring and mentoring roles with boys. Secondly, the idea that boys need positive male role models to ensure a transition to healthy adult masculinity, and that therefore involving more men in boys' care and welfare is key to solving many of the problems faced by young men. Notice, by the way, here that the focus on role models is quite individualised, and I think that is a critical problem, and it tends to slip away from any wider structural critique of what is happening in the economy and the wider society. So I think that's quite an important aspect of the discourse. We looked then at some of the questions around this discourse, and we came up with all of these. I'm sure there are more as well. I'm just going through these briefly. What do we mean by role model? This is a very slippery concept. So are we talking about champions, heroes, mentors? Who are we actually talking about here? So that's an issue. Who are role models? Well, I put up there actually, that's an article from the local newspaper in Milton Keynes, where the Open University is located. And you can see on the left there is Martin Robb, who's the principal investigator for the study, and they've juxtaposed him in the local paper with David Beckham. And actually, if you do media about this stuff, you always get asked who your male role model is, which is kind of weird because we're actually trying to critique this notion, but that just shows how powerful this discourse is for journalists. So who are role models is a problem. Who do you learn from? Do you learn from your parents? Do you learn from teachers? Do you learn from your peers? Do you learn from celebrities in the media? Third point is imitating role models, the way young people learn adult gender identities. And I think there's a weight of evidence to suggest that that's a very limited perspective on how gender is learnt. So, as we've heard many times, I think at this conference, gender and masculinity are a product of a complex set of interactions, practices, shaped by factors such as social class, ethnicity, race, and so on and so forth. And looking at the area that we're interested in with young people, there is research to show how young people negotiate and renegotiate their relationships within peer groups, within formal classes, within adult-child relationships, and so on. So I think the imitating of role models is very simplistic theoretically. It also, moving on to the next point, tends to downplay the role of women and mothers in boys' development. Not just mothers, but also grandmothers, sisters, girlfriends, and so on and so forth. I think that's very important and sometimes gets lost. And what kind of masculinity is proposed as a solution to the problems of boys? Often it's an appeal to a more traditional, dare I say it, authoritarian, disciplining notion of masculinity. Wait till your father gets home. And it seems like we often want men to be involved in order to control boys and young men's behaviour. Okay, just moving on to the research now. Sorry it's taken me some time to get there, but I think it's important to give you a little bit of the background. And I haven't got all research aims on this slide because we had too many, as people often do with research projects. But these are our research aims. I'm not going to go through them all, but as you can see, they do relate to the male role model discourse. And for example, the third one, to what extent is this related to the gender of the worker? But also, how do those relationships play out in practice? Perhaps worth saying that what we're not doing, we're not saying that men shouldn't be involved in families, we're not saying that men shouldn't be recruited to work in services with boys and young men. We're not trying to find out who boys see as their role models. So there are a number of things that people ask us, which we're not trying to do actually. But in reality, we're working out more about gender and the practices between professionals and young men. And when I say services, I'm talking about youth services, leaving care services, services for young people, young men leaving prison, disability services to some extent, care leavers. So a wide range of services working with disadvantaged youth. And in terms of youth, age between sort of 16 and 25. And we also found that there was quite a lot of research in the area of education around some of these themes, so how teachers interact with young men, but very little in some of these wider welfare services, which is partly what led us to want to explore this area. Okay. The activities we're engaged in, we've done a review of the research. There will be an article published by the research team in a journal called Primos, which is the slightly oddly named Journal of Boyhood Studies, in spring next year, so you can look out for that. We've also done a review of recent UK policy initiatives that relate to the male role model discourse, and I'll just mention one example. There's a fairly recent programme which has been established by the coalition government which we have at the moment, called Troops to Teachers. Now, this programme draws upon a US model which has been in existence since about 1994, and what it does is it places ex-military personnel in inner city schools, in particular to work with disadvantaged youth, or disadvantaged young men, should I say. And I think there's a fear that this approach can, if it's not done sensitively, it can reinforce a particular version of masculinity associated with being tough, being hard, physically and mentally, and that very approach can support exactly the kinds of activities which underpin a large part of the problem of boys. So that's an example of male role model discourse being implemented in practice. And incidentally, by the way, I think it's part of the militarization of our society, but I won't go there, it's too big, but I think there's a number of problems with that. Anyway, the main bulk of our work is around the interviews and focus groups with young service users, both young men and young women, and those who work with them. We've interviewed about 30 staff, both male and female. We've interviewed 49 young men and 14 young women. I have to say the research process has been fascinating. I won't say too much about it now, we might talk about it later, but it's certainly shown us how you need to be flexible in engaging young men in some of the situations we're talking about. So just to give you one example, I went to a youth club in North London, largely with black and ethnic minority young men, and they actually thought, as we discovered afterwards, that we were undercover police. They didn't realise, even though we said to them well, maybe because we said to them we're researchers from the Open University, and they said, we think you're undercover police. So the issue of trust and how to gain that in the interview process is actually quite significant. And finally, to say on activities, we're also making a video about our findings with young men and staff as well. So that will be coming up. Okay, emerging themes. I've just got 2 slides on this, and then we'll be finish. Firstly, workers and young people are aware of the role model discourse, but the data doesn't support a straightforward male-to-male transmission of values, attitudes and behaviour, which is what we hypothesised would be the case. I've just put up one quote here. This is from a staff member in the west of Scotland. I don't have any aspirations to be anybody's role model because I don't want them to be like me. I want them to be far better than what I've ever been in life. So he's a staff member who's actively rejecting the notion that he is a role model. Actually, what was more important than gender, although gender was important, was young people viewing other key attributes as significant. So I put some of these up here. Trust, care, building rapport, empathy, reliability, consistency, respecting young people, giving them time. All of these kinds of things which workers did, be they male or female, were valued significantly by young people. And I don't think that's a particularly new finding. I mean, that's a finding from quite a lot of other research as well, but it's interesting to have that confirmed. Okay. Next key point, practitioners are aware of the importance of gender and the need to build inclusive spaces, but often use stereotypical activities to engage young men. So they use shared interests, skills, backgrounds as a way into building relationships with young men. I mean, clearly this is, this is double-edged, but we found this in many projects in the past. So part of the projects which, think of ways to get men in. I mean, they might have a pool table or something. Oh yes, men will come and play pool, and then we'll do other, or car mechanics, whatever, and then we'll do other interesting stuff with them. And actually, I think this is a tension in the work. How do you engage with young men? And that may be something which you have to do. It's certainly what the staff thought was necessary. Having said that, and in terms of how that played out in practice, quite often there seemed to be an expectation on the female staff that they would be doing things like making the tea, cleaning up, all the things that you might have expected that they would end up doing. Whereas the male workers were engaged with young men around practices such as martial arts, fishing, these kinds of things, the activities where they took them out. So I think there are a few interesting questions underneath that point about how project work takes place in practice. Okay, last finding I just wanted to highlight was this one about place and location. It seems from the data that we're finding that young masculinity is shaped by class, not only by class and racial expectations of manhood, but also by place, local identity and local masculine cultures. And I think this is interesting. I've got two quotes here, one for a young man in Scotland, one for a young man in London. The one in Scotland, you can't show a tear or talk about your feelings. If you're a man, drinking and fighting, that's what makes you a man. And this is from an area of the west of Scotland, largely sort of post-industrial, seriously high levels of deprivation and high crime. And yet, for these young men, despite all of that I've just said, they still carry a significant notion of being breadwinner, earning, getting a job, earning for your family, and so on and so forth. So that, set alongside this drinking and fighting stuff, so that was the kind of construction of masculinity in this location in the west of Scotland. Whereas the second quote, round here, yeah, we all know how to get money without working and stuff. People are corrupt and they want to be rich. Joel, a young man from Afro-Caribbean background in London, definitely a greater sense in the London interviews of consumerism, the importance of show, less conviction about the importance of breadwinning, and so on and so forth. Now, I mean, obviously you can, argue with how I've described these two different sets of approaches, but I think there's something very important about location and also about history in how we think about masculinity and how it plays out in different contexts. So we haven't quite worked out what we want to say about that in terms of practice, but I think location is sometimes neglected. So, in this case I'm describing, it was important for white young men as well as black young men as well. So, okay, just briefly, dissemination. We've got an expert seminar on policy implications in January 2015, an end of project report, then a national conference on 12th of March 2015 at the Open University in Milton Keynes. If anybody wants to come to that, it is free. I've got a flyer about it, so do come and talk to me, and be very welcome to come. As I said, we're making a video with staff and young male service users, and we'll also be exploring some staff training and development events with Action for Children. And that's it. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you for highlighting the work which pushes us to interrogate and question our own assumptions about the real role model discourse, and thank you for highlighting the importance of location as well as an important shaping factor in masculinity. So moving on to our third presentation, entitled Global Differences and Burden of Childhood Sexual Violence Against Boys, which focused in 3 countries, Haiti, Kenya, and Cambodia. This study sought to produce the first international comparable estimate of the magnitude, characteristics, and consequences of sexual violence against boys in these 3 diverse countries. And presenting that work will be Stephen Sumner. Stephen is an academic intelligence service officer with the Division of Violence Prevention of the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I thought we had long titles at the U.S. Stephen, without further ado, the floor is yours.
The prevention of sexual violence against children is a clear goal for many countries of the world. However, most countries currently don't have any surveillance system to collect nationally representative data on the magnitude of the problem. Consequently, most of the information that we do have in most countries of the world comes largely from smaller research studies, which differ significantly in geographic scope and even definition of the problem. A recent meta-analysis of such studies indicated that, depending on which country of the world you're looking at, the prevalence of sexual violence against girls ranged anywhere from 11 to 21%, and among boys from 4% to 19%. It's also important to note that of the literature that exists on the prevalence of sexual violence against children, the number of studies on women and girls outnumbers that of boys about 2 to 1. Preventing sexual violence against males is important for a number of reasons. First of all, children who are victims of sexual violence are at an increased likelihood of later developing a number of adverse health outcomes, including infectious diseases such as HIV and sexually transmitted illnesses. They're also at higher risks of developing mental health problems like depression and drug addiction, and even go on to develop diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other non-communicable diseases at higher rates as well. But as we all know, understanding sexual violence against males is important in understanding how to prevent sexual violence against females. According to the best available international estimates, boys who are victims of sexual violence as a child are at a later 2/3 increased risk of perpetrating rape against a woman sometime in their life. Beginning in 2007, as part of an effort to strengthen global surveillance on sexual violence against children, the CDC, as part of a collaboration known as Together for Girls, which includes PEPFAR, UNICEF, and other partners, began developing a methodology for determining nationwide prevalence data on sexual violence. This is known as the Violence Against Children surveys, or the VACs. The VACs are multi-stage cluster surveys which are nationally representative. They typically operate off of a host country's census sampling frame, and they utilize household face-to-face interviews with young people ages 13 to 24. Interviews are conducted with interviewers of the same gender as the participants. Haiti, Kenya, and Cambodia were among the first 3 countries of the world that in which we interviewed males in addition to females, and so this allowed us to look at the magnitude, circumstances, consequences, and risk factors of sexual violence in these 3 diverse countries of the world. The Haiti, Kenya, and Cambodia violence against children surveys were all conducted between 2010 and 2013. All surveys interviewed over 1,200 males and had response rates greater than 80%. I'd like to share with you some of the findings from these surveys. In Haiti, 23.1% of males experienced any form of sexual violence as a child, that is prior to the age of 18, compared to 14.8% in Kenya and 5.6% in Cambodia. Now, this measure of any sexual violence is actually comprised of 3 different types of sexual violence that all show the same pattern of Haiti having the largest burden, followed by Kenya, and then Cambodia. So the 3 categories that make up any sexual violence is first, unwanted sexual touching. The second is attempted but not completed sex. And the third and final category is unwanted sex that is actually completed. Differences between these countries are statistically significant. In terms of the perpetrators of the sexual violence, Kenya had the highest proportion of perpetrators who were romantic partners. Cambodia had the highest proportion who were family members or relatives. In all 3 countries, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances accounted for the overall largest share of perpetrators, and strangers were a relatively small share of perpetrators in all 3 countries. In terms of the location of the sexual violence, the victim's home was the #1 location of the violence in all 3 countries. Other notable differences are that in Haiti, a relatively larger share of events occurred at the perpetrator's home. A similar share occurred outdoors in all 3 countries. And in Kenya, compared to the other 2 countries, a greater fraction occurred in or around the victim's school. As part of the analysis, we also looked at several risk and protective factors for sexual violence. The ones that I've presented here are ones that were consistently asked across all countries at this point, and include various social and economic variables. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to show you pooled analyses of all 3 countries together. So, looking at unadjusted bivariate analyses, in other words, the relationship between each factor in sexual violence, being an orphan, which is defined as having lost one or more parents before the age of 18, as well as having to work for money as a child, were associated with an increased risk of sexual violence victimization. Participants who reported that they were able to talk openly with their family experienced a protective effect against sexual violence. When we put all these factors into something called a multivariable logistic regression, they all maintain their significant associations. Just to give you a sense of the prevalence of these risk factors in the entire sample, about 18% of boys who had never experienced sexual violence in these 3 countries were orphans, compared to 26.7% who had experienced some form of sexual violence. In terms of having to work for money as a child, about 47% of those not having experienced sexual violence had to work for money, compared to 58% among those who had experienced sexual violence. And lastly, although participants generally reported that they were able to talk openly with their families, about 9 out of 10 boys, the percentage was slightly smaller among those boys who had experienced sexual violence. We additionally looked at consequences of sexual violence, and I've displayed a few of those here. So the green bars display display boys who have experienced sexual violence before the age of 18, and the pink or purple bars are those who have not experienced sexual violence. What we can see is that boys who were victims of sexual violence reported sexually transmitted disease symptoms to a higher degree, as well as participation in transactional sex. The adjusted odds ratios that you see at the top of each bar graph are from multivariable logistic regression models that control for all of the factors I showed previously on the risk factor slide. Beyond sexually transmitted disease symptoms, we looked at some indicators of mental health. You can see that boys who experienced sexual violence had an increased likelihood of reporting depression symptoms, as well as suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts. And finally, we also explored the association between experiencing sexual violence and adverse or negative gender attitudes. So boys who were victims of sexual violence were at an increased likelihood of feeling justified in beating their wife for reasons such as going out without telling him, neglecting the children, arguing, or even refusing to have sex. Some limitations of the study should be noted. Because this is a survey, and some of the events that occurred in an individual's life may have occurred distantly. Recall bias certainly may have been present. Again, because of the sensitive nature of the topic, non-disclosure, I think, is always an issue in surveys on sexual violence. If you recall, this is a household survey, so we're really only able to assess sexual violence among residential household dwelling populations. We miss out on important segments of the population which may have particularly high risks, such as street children. And lastly, because it's a cross-sectional survey, causality cannot be inferred, and the temporal relationships between certain variables is not precisely known. What we can say is that we've seen differences between the countries in terms of the prevalence of sexual violence among children, as well as some of the circumstances, yet consequences were similar and pervasive. It seems that locally tailored strategies for each nation really need to be considered. There are several steps that can be taken building on this work. First, when the Millennium Development Goals expire in 2015, including the prevention of sexual violence against children, both girls and boys, is important to stimulate accountability and interest in this important area of intervention. Also, as part of, I should mention, as part of the Violence Against Children surveys, the surveys in and of themselves attempt to stimulate action. As part of the rollout of each survey, host countries form a multi-sectoral task force and develop a response plan to each survey. So far, every country's response has been unique. Several countries have completed the survey thus far, including Swaziland, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Haiti, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Malawi, and several more are set to come online within the next 1 to 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for presenting the look into the reality and picture of the abuse and violence that boys face, pointing out the consequences and, of course, the influence of violence on gender norms itself. And thank you for pointing out the action that's been taken in all of those countries as a result of this research. I'd like to introduce us to the last presentation, last but not least, entitled Intimate Partner Violence in Men's and Women's Experiences During Childhood, an analysis of data from 7 states across India. That presentation will be delivered by Abhishek Gautam. Abhishek is the Technical specialist at the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW. He's a statistician by education and a demographer by occupation. His areas of interest include working on gender issues with a focus on violence against women, men, masculinity, reproductive
My time
health.
has started.
Sorry?
My time has started.
Sorry, you got more time. Okay, I'll be quiet. Steve, it's all yours.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. So till now we have heard a lot about children and men. Now what I am going to talk about in this presentation is give an overview of the intimate partner violence which is prevalent in India and different states, and then how the childhood experiences of men and women make them shape their current attitudes and behavior. So this is a very small piece of the study that we did in India with support from UNFPA, and we have released the entire study on the first day of this symposium. So to start with, like we all know, the global lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence among ever partnered women is around 30%. These are the WHO estimates, and if we look in the Southeast Asia region, the prevalence goes up to 40%. In India, the only survey which provides data on IPV was National Family Health Survey, which was conducted in 2005 and 6. And according to that, out of 1 or 2 women out of 5 have experienced some form of violence. But we didn't have any data which talks about men's perpetration of violence. And in lot of efforts by government as well as social organizations are going on to reduce this IPV, and from government side in 2004 the Protection of Women and Domestic Violence Act was launched along with several other campaigns, but still the awareness and people mindset have not changed. The reason being the underlying role of societal norms and the construct that affects men's and women's behavior is less understood. So in this piece, we have tried to understand access men's and women's current behavior and attitude on wide range of issues as they relate to gender equality, and then explore men's and women's experiences or witnessing inequality during childhood as a causal pathway to their current behavior around IPV. So before I move forward, just to give an overview of the methodology and the coverage, we have done this study in 7 states of India, and these states are one of the biggest states in India, and they have a very diverse sex ratio. So that was the prime reason for selecting all these states. And Punjab and Haryana are the 2 states which were combined and considered as one domain for the study. We have a representative sample at the state level of 1500 men and 500 women aged 18 to 49 years. And since we have a huge rural population, thus to adjust for the rural and urban population, have a representative sample of rural and urban population, we distributed the sample in the ratio 60:40, and multi-state cluster sampling approach was used. For the study, we adapted the images and partner for prevention tool, which James talked about, that it has been used in many multi-country studies. That was adapted and translated into inter-regional languages like Marathi, Odia, the local languages which are spoken in the states. And we covered a total of 9,205 men and 3,158 women in our study. The state-wise distribution is given below, except for the Punjab and Haryana, where we had some shortfall in case of men sample. In most states we were able to achieve the required desired sample. Now coming to the key findings. For measuring the intimate partner violence, we had a series of questions covering different forms of violence, like emotional, economic, physical and sexual. And responses on these set of questions were further taken together, and a composite index was created for each form of violence. So this is the result which we see, the prevalence of IPV ever as well as in past 12 months. So if we see, almost 60% of men reported perpetrating any form of violence in ever, as well as if we look at the past 12 months, it is also very high. Around 34% of men have reported perpetration of violence. Similarly, in the women sample, we got more than half of the women have experienced any form of violence. By different form of violence, if we look, then in case of men, emotional violence was mostly reported, followed by physical and sexual. While in case of women, it was physical violence followed by emotional and interestingly, the physical violence and the economic violence was much more highly reported by women as compared to men in both ever as well as in past 12 months. Now these are the state-wise prevalence of violence ever. If you see the state like Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, they have a very high prevalence of violence. Means around 75-73% of men have reported perpetration of violence, and same is for women. Similarly, for past 12 months, if we see, it's very high in Odisha and Uttar Pradesh. But interesting thing here is to see is that Punjab and Haryana, though the prevalence of violence reported by men and women is low, but in these states, the women reporting of experiencing violence is higher as compared to what men have reported. Whereas in all other states, men reporting is always high as compared to what women have reported. Now the key factor which we wanted to test, like there has been lot of literature which says that childhood experience shapes the current behavior of the people. From our study also we wanted to test the same thing. So in our study we measured witnessing or experiencing discrimination or harassment using a 15 statements were asked, which captured different forms of violence, childhood trauma, gender related attitudes perceived in family or in family origin, and witnessing father and mother taking decision together. These are the two variables that we use to see what are the childhood experiences they have and how it links to the current violent behavior. So the childhood experiences, if we see, more than 80% of men as well as women have experienced some form of discrimination or harassment during their childhood. And in terms of decision making, we asked whether who is the prime decision maker at your family when you were growing up. So among men, it was 65% of men reported that it was mainly the father who was the main decision maker, while 57% of women said it was the father. These are the figures for the state. We won't go much into it. Just to highlight here that in Punjab and Haryana and Madhya Pradesh are the only two states where nearly around 1/4 of the men said that they have never experienced any form of discrimination or harassment. Whereas in other states, like we see Odisha, it's almost 66% of men have reported often experiencing or witnessing any form of discrimination. Among women, the situation is very clear. Except for Punjab, Haryana, Maharashtra, where 22% women said they have never experienced. In all the other states, it's either less than 10 or 13% only in case of Punjab, Haryana. Now we try to look at the association. This is the same witnessing decision making in the family. Now we come to see the association between childhood experience and IPV in past 12 months. Those who have experienced any form of discrimination, what is the reporting of perpetration or experience of violence by them for men and women? So the above graph shows for the men, and it is very evident that those who have sometime or often experienced any form of discrimination are much more likely to have a violent behavior. And same is in the case of women, and it was statistically significant too. For decision making, the variable decision making does not show much impact in case of women, where 33% reported that those who have mother and father as joint decision maker in the family, they have experienced more violence. While in case of men, it was in the expected direction. Now in order to control for the other factors, we did apply a multivariate model to see still that trend continues or not. And as we see that in all the states as well as aggregate level, the childhood discrimination of those who have often experienced are much more likely to be violent, or in case of women, much more likely to experience violence. And the low background characteristics like education, wealth index, religion, caste, these were controlled in this model. So, to conclude, there is a high prevalence of intimate partner violence in the country, and men forms of violence like emotional followed by physical and sexual are more prevalent, while among women it's physical followed by emotional and sexual. And women reporting physical and emotional is higher than men's reporting. And what we were trying to test here was the hypothesis that experience or witnessing discrimination or harassment during childhood shapes the current behavior holds very true. And this finding reinforces the relationship established by other studies like images, as well as the same study which we did in Nepal and Vietnam. What needs to be done is changing men's and women's attitude around gender equality earlier in their lives, while their own personal experiences of childhood are shaping them. That's a critical way to improve their relationship and their ability to counteract social expectations later as adults. And for this, school-based and community-based programs to engage young boys and girls from early age through reflective learning and dialogue are one of the most critical ways to begin to change the gender normative attitudes around masculinity, male control, and acceptance of violence. We thank United Nations Population Fund for commissioning this study to us and all the study participants who participated in this study.
Striking evidence which highlights. Can you hear me? Yeah. Interesting how you pointed out the different ways that women and men perceive and report the violence in fact, and highlighting that these different experiences around harassment and discrimination in childhood really do have an effect on how future violence takes place. I'd like to thank all the presenters. I think this body of work is so important and needed if we're really to fully understand and address the scope of violence in its various forms and manifestations, causes, consequences. Tremendously humbling to be up here to listen to all of these wonderful pieces of research and evidence. I'd like to open the floor now. We've got about 20 minutes for some discussion and question and answer. I'd like to kindly ask that you keep your interventions short and succinct, and if you have a particular presenter that you want to direct your question to, please let us know. Do we have a rolling microphone? Okay, great.
Yes, hi. First, thanks to all of you for the really wonderful presentation. It was very informative. I just want to ask if any of you know of or have conducted any research on female perpetrators of violence. I think it's something that can tell us maybe a lot about masculinity and femininity and the use of power. And it kind of links back to this idea that boys who are experiencing violence, sexual violence as children are more likely to become perpetrators. I think when we think about the rates of violence against young girls, that doesn't necessarily proceed in the same way. So just a question of curiosity.
Thank you. We'll take a round of questions and then let the panel respond. So many hands. Okay. Yes, ma'am. You in the front and then you, sir.
I don't need a microphone. I can just.
No, we need, because it's being recorded, so we need to hear your voice.
You always need a microphone.
Thanks. My questions are directed towards Steve. What about sex trafficking girls? Does the study include talk about that we are in. Well, I mean, I'm curious about it because in India, that's a huge issue. And next, Abhishek, I've got two questions. You have noted state variation, and Maharashtra stands out. And from my analysis, I've seen that connections with natal family is a very important factor. There's huge state variation, North India and South India. Are you exploring that? That's nothing. And the other question is about decision making. Decision making is a very large area. Like, we know even in India that domestic decision making is mostly left to women, like what vegetables to buy. So, have you differentiated between different types of decision making? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Promise the mic to this gentleman here.
Thank you. Peter Grant from Restored in the UK. I wanted to ask, across these various studies, whether any of you found any evidence of faith or religion shaping values and attitudes and indeed behaviours in this area.
Daniel? Yes. Gentleman right here.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm from the Ministry of Health in Brazil. I work at Men's Health Coordination. And I would just, thanks for the presentation, some really important information and data. But I'm really frustrated. I mean, I was frustrated with this issue back in the first symposium in Rio de Janeiro. So I think I'm even more frustrated about this now, because I think all these years have passed and still we're talking a lot about men's violence. And I was expecting to hear some more about men's vulnerabilities and men that suffer violence, especially adult men. I don't know what happens. Why do not we study these men? We don't study these men as much. We don't study this violence as much. We don't study urban and community violence as much. And men are in Brazil 92% of homicide victims, and we have over 50,000 homicides a year in Brazil. And these are not just any men. These are poor men, black men, young men from favelas, from slum areas. These are not hegemonic male model masculinities like James was saying. So my question is why? Why are we so shy and timid to talk about all these young men that are being killed? So that's the question that I want to put out.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, sir. Our dear colleague from Stonegate here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you're a good man. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the presentation. I think I want to echo what the previous speaker said. My own frustration as to since we know what we call what are the solution? What I'm talking about, and I think it was Sandy, you spoke about. I mean, how difficult it is. I mean, I was asking Obama, what do we mean by role models? And suddenly, it appeared the same question I was asking you privately. It was on one of your slides. And what do we mean? What do you understand? I mean, I grew up. I've never met my father. I don't know him. And lots and lots of men, but in particular black men, where I come from. But also, other than the issue of role modeling, we haven't been able, and as a solution, but we have not been able to say, but in fact, even the economy that these men in particular live under meditate against them wanting to be good men, whatever that would mean, So I thought we would really touch on those, and I agree with him about, we never talk about the men's vulnerability, how do they contribute in what men ultimately become? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. I'll think let's do this side of the room. Anybody on this side have a question? Yeah. Okay. And wait on the front. I'm afraid we'll have to let the panelists respond, and then we can do another round. You already have the mic. Yeah. Okay. All right. Make it short, but I probably share the mic too. So please.
Thank you.
That was me.
I'm Grandma from Ethiopia, working for CARE. My question was to Stephen. Would like to get a little bit of background and profile of respondents to really understand the dynamics of violence. The way I do represent it somehow doesn't tell about the class and the areas, urban, rural, and the demography of respondents. How we read it and just understand where that violence comes from.
Thank you. Okay. Last one, and then we'll let the gentleman respond.
Apologies for coming late. There's something I just wanted to share from another session. It was about how boys who see violence in the home are more likely to do it to their partners later on. I found it very interesting because I never looked at it this way. A psychologist, a Norwegian psychologist, told us that detailed counseling had been done with perpetrators, and he said that exposure to violence led to trauma, which led to destruction of the normal attachment process. And then there was a low ability to practice empathy. And that's why you became. It's not because you thought it was automatically okay. And I think this ties in with men's vulnerability. Their whole psychological counseling, I guess.
Thank you very much for those questions. Gentlemen, who would like to respond? Abhishek, do you want to go first? Because a couple of them were directed to you specifically.
So the question about Maharashtra and natal family, we do have the data on the type of family they reside in, and we have that in the model. So I have not presented here, but the family effect is very prominent. Those who have stay with their family and attached to the natal family are less likely to be violent. And the second, on the decision making, we have 4-5 set of questions like who takes the decision at the household level for the larger investments and other things, and this variable was combined, took into account all those 3 questions, and then it was found.
Has it been disaggregated by which type of decision? Do you see any pattern in terms of women taking decision in certain areas?
So that was very clear.
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to respond?
Sure. There were a couple questions for me. The first was touching on sex trafficking, which is a huge area of interest. And it's also a difficult one for us to get at in our surveys because, as I mentioned, they're household surveys, and you can imagine individuals that maybe trafficked might not be the person that you get when you knock on the door and the door opens and you seek to interview someone. I will say that we were attempting to get some better information. One of the things that you may have noticed is that, relatively speaking, we had lower numbers for sexual violence in Cambodia, and we're currently doing the Laos survey right now, and so we added questions on that survey on migration, and so that may give us a better sense. Of potential trafficking, but really, I think probably the methodology for dealing with extremely vulnerable populations has to be a little bit different than a household survey. And then the second question was on the profile of respondents. So in each country, the way it works in the sort of multi-stage sampling, and in the countries that presented, there's either 2 or 3 levels. And so first, what the country is sort of divided up into geographical units. Usually those are already existing geographical units. And then those units are randomly selected, and then villages and households within those geographical units are next randomly selected. And so at the end of that, what you have essentially mathematically is you have a representative sample of the entire population. So the percentages I presented represent each country completely demographically in terms of proportion of urban, rural, that sort of thing. I didn't. I only presented to give you specific numbers on which segments of the population the boys fell into. I didn't have any slides on that beyond the risk factor slide where I showed you just a limited number of things, just how many of the boys had to work for money and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is that the numbers represent each country in a representative fashion.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay. James, do you want to have a stab at 10,000 factors?
Thank you. I will try to respond to Daniel. I share your frustration. I mean, I think we've been talking a long time about individual kinds of violence, or we've been putting these silos around different types of violence, and then we kind of compete. So there's violence against children, violence against women, violence against men, violence against transgender people, violence against the elderly, violence against the disabled. And what we've talked about at this table, besides Sandy's qualitative work, was actually individual level risk factors on certain kinds of perpetration. So what we're missing out on is actually the big picture. Yes, there's experiences in childhood that drive risks of perpetration or victimization later in life. But what's the context of that childhood? And that's what I was trying to get at with some of the data that's emerging, and I think when we tell the stories behind the numbers, what I think all of us were trying to reinforce is that we have to look at the larger context, and this has been said over and over in this conference. And our friend Quentin from New York City gave a very interesting picture of one neighborhood in Brooklyn where violence against women was highest, along with police perpetration and harassment, incarceration of men, HIV among girls. And so, let's stop talking about individual kinds of violence, including female perpetration. And let's talk about, what are the intersections of violences, from militarization down to intimate partner violence. How are systems responding to that? If orphans are most at risk, why is the state not responding to that? Why can't we look at, what, again, Lori was saying is this life burden of violence and contextualize it like that? Because I think that's really why we're missing out.
Right, I'll just talk about the questions about vulnerability of men, because I do think that's very important. I've been heavily influenced by the work of Jeff Hurd and Keith Pringle, and their formulation that we need to look at the problems then create, but also the problems then experience, I think is really right, and that's part of a feminist perspective. Clearly there's loads to do around problems then create, but there's also loads around problems they experience too. Now, you couldn't have gone through some of the interviews that I did, particularly in the west of Scotland, without being confronted by violence in the narratives of young men. I mean, it's absolutely, so huge. I can't really tell you. In the first 2 minutes, this guy is showing you some huge scar that he has, and you hear his life history and, realise the chaotic background he's come from. So it was very much part of the story of the young men in our study. And I think, that's as a result of a number of different things. So, the shell of bravado and toughness that young men create around themselves, clinging on to traditional notions of being masters of the household, peer group pressure to be one of the lads, and gang stuff was huge also in our work. So, I don't deny what you're saying, both of you, is true. Of course, it's hard to know where to start in terms of what to do about it, and there are all kinds of programs. One thing just in the UK, which I think is a little bit hopeful, is actually the rise of feminist movement again amongst young women, and the relations that young women who are more sensitised around these issues, and they have been had for some time, the relations that they are having with young men, and the influence they are having over young men's thoughts and attitudes, I think is important. So, for instance, where I live in Oxford, a number of the colleges now are doing classes, sessions for young men around sexual consent. These are all students. This wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. But this is really important stuff that's happening. I mean, I'm not sure if that's necessarily getting to some of the troubled young men that we're really concerned about, but there is something kind of interesting happening in the woodwork there. So I think that's something that's hopeful. I also think actually that young men are interested to talk about gender issues and sexuality issues and so on. They don't have too many fora to do that, and also the sources of information for them are often very, very poor. I mean, anyone who's been in Michael Flood's session has heard him talk about the impact of pornography on young men. This is the kind of area that a mechanism that young men are getting some of their information about these kinds of issues. So there are important things to think about there too. I think I better stop actually. Maybe not do another round of questions. But
yeah, that would be great. We've got a few more minutes. Yes, sir. And I can't ignore you. You're right there.
Andoji from Namibia. Sandy, are we as the larger group, in terms of globally, are we actually condoning, supporting what happens on the ground when we still stand by when we say boys will be boys? Is there something that we actually need to maybe change about that? James talked about in your presentation something about the highest, was it 40% of men who felt like entitlement to sex was why they rape. If I remember the numbers, it was something like 40% in that particular arena or area. 40% of men who said, I rape because I have an entitlement to sex. That's 40. The other 60 that are not raping. They are not raping, but do they have the same mindset? What are we doing to dismantle this thing in men, that we are entitled to women, that we are entitled to sex, that you cannot have, you must have sex 30 days in a month, otherwise you are not man enough. What are we doing about that part? I'm from Namibia, and my problem in Namibia is that they say I'm sick in the head when I tell for the world that it's now 32 years without cheating. 34 years, the last time I attempted to sexually violate a woman. It's like, what? Something is wrong. Maybe you don't have balls. Maybe what's wrong? What are we doing in the global arena to change, to help change the men who are not in the extreme, violating, but still have the same kind of a mindset?
Okay, thank you so much. One more, and I've neglected the back, so yes, sir. Okay. Yes, white ribbon, I think, and then you, sir. Thank you. And then we really have to close.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great presentations. Umberto from White Ribbon Canada. My question is for Sandy on the question of role models. And I'm just wondering if you've taken a look at some of the work that's been done around the world with this idea of role modeling. So the work of Promundo in Brazil, the work of Men Care, One Men Can in South Africa, our own White Ribbon campaign in Canada. It starts with your own role as a White Ribbon ambassador in the UK. These are all really great examples of programs that are engaging men to be good role models in the community for the people, for the men around them, for the young people around them. And because I think that the concept of role model that you presented is one where men are modeling hegemonic types of masculinity, and we would all agree, that is not the kind of role modeling that we want men to do. But if we give men the tools and the information and the ideas to be good role models in their lives, in the community and such, just like you've received from White Ribbon UK, wouldn't that be a great way to engage men and to encourage them to be positive influences for the young people around them? So just wondering if you took a look at that side of the idea of role modeling.
Thank you so much. And yes, sir, last question and then response.
Georgie Price with UNICEF here in India. My question is in relation to the multi-country quantitative study. Did you consider looking at the social constructions, cultural constructions of masculinities and femininities in relation to these studies? Or are there methodological or political reasons why so few public health studies of violence to look at the big elephant in the room, as far as I, as an anthropologist, am concerned.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, gentlemen, please.
I can just quickly answer that last question. I mean, this quantitative survey, the multi-country study on looking at men's and violence and vulnerability, was complemented by a large body of qualitative research. And our actually the theories, the literature that we drew on were and one of the advisors to this was Raymond Connell. So we were very much talking about or trying to test theories around hegemonic masculinity, and we explored social norms and power systems in different ways. We also did political analysis, where we did qualitative interviews with, or depth interviews with policymakers, government officials, and the people which they serve, about why systems aren't working, what norms are driving them.
Okay. On the 2 points that were addressed to me, the issue about boys will be boys and challenging that. I mean, clearly we need to be doing that. I can't really talk about it globally. I talk in relation to the UK more easily. But I think one of the issues there is that we don't really have a clear sense of what a healthy masculinity looks like, and that's an issue that we need to explore a bit more. In terms of what to do about it, clearly there are things that schools can do in sex and relationships education. I'm unaware. There's a great book by someone called David Jackson, Challenging Macho Values, which explores how schools operate and the kind of programs that they run in schools. That's a very limited and quick answer to the scale of your issue, to be honest. On the role modelling issue, I'm not saying don't do this stuff. I am aware of the work that's done by Famundo and Care and many others. I'm just trying to raise questions about it really and say that this isn't necessarily a panacea. And let's actually just explore this a little bit deeper. There's this notion which seems to be becoming more sort of reified that boys learn from men, and therefore we mean that that girls learn from women. Well, it's much more complicated than that. So all I'm doing really is asking the questions, and what I'm suggesting at the start seems to be borne out by our research. But I also agree with you that positive masculinity is a good thing. So.
Thank you, Senator. Stephen, did you want to?
I just wanted to go back to the one earlier question that the gentleman asked about what are the solutions, because that ultimately is the big question that we need to always come back to. And I think the answer to that really highlights how very much so we're in the nascent phase of this area. If you were at the session that occurred just before this, Lori had on her slides the 4 programs that I'm aware are the only programs within the public health or medical sphere that have been tested in randomized controlled trials and essentially constitute legitimate evidence for their effectiveness. And the ones that she had on her slide were SASA, the program out of Uganda, the Stepping Stones program. There's been 1 or 2 studies on microfinance or cash transfers in terms of preventing violence. And then there was a recent one looking at self-defense, although the evidence on that is more mixed when you look at different countries. So those are the 4 studies that we have, and it just shows you how many more program evaluations we need. Clearly, there's a lot of people here who are doing programs, and so linking up with researchers or people who can sort of provide that quantitative guidance so that your program can be put in a journal, have it validated scientifically, and then drive resources toward those programs. I think that's an important step that will need to happen over the next few years.
Would you agree that the state violence itself sends confusing, militating, contradictory messages? On the one hand, you're saying that these are programs that are ideal, but you have state violence that is also problematic. Would you agree?
I didn't understand the question.
So
we really have to stop here because we're out of time, but there were lots of other questions, and for the pending questions that may not have gotten answered, I encourage all of you to please approach these gentlemen afterwards. But please join me in thanking the presenters today. Thank you very, very much. And,
Thank you. Like subliminal swag. I don't I know because I don't think the rating